Hello, Laverne here, and thank you for joining me. In this video, I'm going to be discussing the 3 deaths that are talked about in Scripture and the significance of them. Now, I know a lot of people understand and they're aware of 2 of these deaths, that being eternal death and physical death. But what many people are unaware of is that Scripture talks about spiritual death, and we need to understand the spiritual death if we are to understand the significance of what happened on the cross, and if we are going to understand the true curse that was brought into the world when Adam and Eve sinned. Because a misunderstanding of what the curse was and what kind of death it was that entered the world has led to people being in conflict with science and being in conflict with the world around them. And this in turn has resulted in stunted faith. Faith has been stunted because of a misunderstanding of Scripture, poor theology, poor doctrine, or rather false doctrine. And this all stems from the traditions that have been taught in the church regarding the death that entered the world when Adam and Eve sinned. Now I'm going to include in the sidebar some scriptures that refer to and talk a little bit about spiritual death. I'm not going to get into each of those verses and passages, but I just ask that if you are going to respond in any way with comment or video response, that you first read those passages. I will speak briefly on a couple of them. Jesus says, when a man was talking about being one of his followers, and this man wanted to return and bury one of his family members, and Jesus said, "Let the spiritually dead bury their dead." Paul says that he dies daily, but surely he is not talking about dying physically daily. So we see there is reference to spiritual death in the Bible. But some of the greatest, revelations as to the understanding of the different deaths is in Genesis. Because in Genesis, in chapter 3, God says, and I'm paraphrasing a little bit here, I just ask that you will read the passage yourself. God says, if Adam and Eve were to eat of the tree of life, then they would live forever like us. And so God kicks them out of the Garden of Eden so that it would prevent them from eating the tree of life. Therefore, Adam and Eve were not immortal at the time of eating from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. You see, physical death was always a part of the cycle, has always been part of the cycle of life and death. This was not something that entered the world when Adam and Eve sinned, but rather it was spiritual death that entered the world. Another point of fact here is that Adam and Eve did not die physically when they ate the fruit. However, they did separate themselves from God when they tried to hide from Him. And then God, in expelling them from the Garden of Eden, separated Himself even more from them. And it is this separation, this is spiritual death, this separation from God. Now, this is so important because this misunderstanding is a pillar of young earth creationists. These people who believe that the earth is young and that death only became a part of life when Adam and Eve sinned. But when we have a full understanding, or rather a true understanding of the death that entered the world and that it was spiritual death rather than physical death, then we take away this pillar and this whole idea, this false theology of young earth, it begins to fall to pieces. We see that it simply is not true. And it is this false understanding that death entered the world, physical death entered the world when Adam and Eve sinned, that has caused this friction and this conflict between science and faith. But when we realize that it was spiritual death that entered and not physical death, then this conflict that we see between science and Christianity, we see that it is something that has been caused from the church due to its misunderstanding of the kind of death that entered the world. Now, something else I want to talk about, because this is this understanding of death has a great significance to what happened on the cross. You see, Jesus, in the Garden of Gethsemane, he was sweating blood because of the stress that he was enduring, knowing that he was going to drink from this cup of suffering. And this cup of suffering had nothing to do with the physical peril that he was about to go through, the torture and the physical death. This was not what he feared, but rather it was the spiritual death. And I shouldn't say that Jesus feared it. It was just something he did not want to endure. Physical death had no relevance. It simply wasn't of real consequence. Spiritual death, on the other hand, did. This was the cup of suffering that he was talking about, that he knew that when he took on the sins of the world, that he would become separated from God and that he would suffer spiritual death. This is the cup of suffering that he was talking about. For him, for a man such as he, to be separated from God, it was just something that was almost unbearable for him. And this is why he was praying about this cup being passed on, that something he would not have to go through. This is the curse that he suffered on the cross. The curse that was prophesied about in the Old Testament. It is not, as so many people have taught, that the Romans believed that somebody who died on the cross was cursed. This is very trite, and it's almost an insult to say that this is the curse that was prophesied about. No. The true curse that Jesus suffered on the cross is that when he took on the sins of the world, God turned his back on him. And this is why Jesus cried out on the cross, God, God, why hast thou forsaken me? It's because he felt that spiritual death and that separation from God. This is the curse that entered the world when Adam and Eve sinned, and this is the curse that Jesus endured on the cross. So this is why I say it's so important to understand the three kinds of deaths that are talked about in Scripture: physical death, spiritual death, and eternal death. We have no reason to fear anyone who can take our physical life. However, we need to greatly fear the one who can cause us to suffer eternal death. And the spiritual death is that what lies in between. It is this spiritual death that, if not reconciled through Jesus Christ, we will then suffer eternal death. All right, as always, I look forward to comments, messages, and hopefully the odd video response. I'd really like to hear from those who believe that Scripture is talking about physical death. Where is your Scripture, and why is it that you believe it is physical death that entered the world when Adam and Eve sinned, rather than spiritual death? All right, till next time, peace and blessings.